Our next speaker, is going to be Spiridoula Gravini from the University of Rochester.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here today, both physically and virtually. In this talk, I will be presenting IskiOS, a system designed to provide efficient intra-kernel isolation for security defenses against control flow hijacking attacks. And this is joint work with Mohammad Hedayati, John Criswell, and Michael Scott from University of Rochester. Control flow hijacking attacks violate the expected control flow of a program to take over execution and control its behavior. It goes without saying that when the target is the operating system kernel, the security of the entire system is at risk. An attack will typically exploit a memory safety vulnerability in the kernel. Usually a malicious user program will corrupt a function pointer or a return address in kernel memory and set it to the address of a desired code sequence. When control is redirected to that point, the attacker will typically continue by taking over other processes running on the system. Defenses exist, and they range from control flow integrity enforcement to leakage resilient diversification techniques. Control flow integrity, or CFI, ensures that only valid control flow paths are followed during execution. CFI, however, without return address protection, has been shown to be not to be secure. And in order to make it secure, solutions need to adopt write-protected shadow stacks, which save copies of the return addresses on a protected memory region. On the other hand, leakage-resilient diversification schemes break any prior knowledge of the code layout in memory, making it harder for an attacker to discover useful code sequences during execution. Of course, it would be meaningless if the attacker could simply just read the code segment. So solutions need to put the code into execute-only memory. That is memory that can be executed, but neither read nor written. And while different, these techniques, they share one thing. They both require efficient and flexible intra-kernel isolation. For example, for the execute-only memory, no load instruction should fetch any byte from the code segment. And for the shadow stack, no write instruction should ever overwrite the protected memory. Unfortunately, the existing approaches fall short either in efficiency or flexibility or both. And this is what this work addresses. We utilize new hardware, namely Intel PKU, to enable efficient and flexible intra-kernel isolation, to enable execute-only permissions for kernel memory, a protection mode that is not directly supported by the x86 architecture. And we equip the Linux kernel with execute-only memory for its code segment, as well as the first ever, to the best of our knowledge, write-protected race-free shadow stacks. In doing so, we solve several challenges. First, we enable PKU for kernel memory with low overhead. We need to maintain the compatibility with Intel hardening features such as Intel SMAP and SMAP. And we need to prevent malicious applications from reconfiguring PKU in a way that jeopardizes the security of our system. Now, first things first, let's talk a bit more about the current state of existing approaches for intra-kernel isolation on x86. Most approaches, they use software fault isolation, and typically they add runtime bound checks on memory accesses to restrict access to the sensitive data. The bound checks can be implemented either purely in software or they can be accelerated in hardware, typically with Intel MPX on x86. Unfortunately, Intel MPX as of recently has been deprecated, and software solutions are not fast enough to be deployed. And this is not the only limitation of SFI. More importantly is that as the cost of bound checking is proportional to the number of protected regions, these approaches, they only protect one domain at a time. And they need to rearrange memory for efficiency so that they group all the sensitive information together, typically at the upper part of the memory of the virtual address space, so that a single bound must be checked. This requires high engineering effort, especially when it comes to memory allocators. And also, it lowers the entropy of existing code randomization schemes. However, on the other hand, from user space, we have learned that efficient and flexible intra-process is feasible through new hardware. Specifically, Hodor and ERIM are two such systems that use Intel PKU, also known as MPK, to isolate memory within a process at low domain switching costs and without memory layout modifications. Now a bit more on PKU. PKU, as of the Skylake server generation of processors, Intel has introduced Intel Protection Keys for User Space, or PKU, which is mainly a memory safety enhancement feature. So PKU introduces a 32-bit PKRU register and two unprivileged instructions, dubbed read PKRU and write PKRU, to read and modify the contents of this register respectively. PKU associates every user page in memory with 1 out of 16 protection domains by setting 4 previously unused bits in every page table entry to the appropriate domain protection key value. It also associates 2 bits in the PKRU register named access disable and the write disable with every domain, which encode the access permissions, if any, that will be dropped from every domain. So, for example, if we had the 2 domains and the page table entry for a page belonging to domain 0, and we had the right access to it, then even though from the traditional permissions the access would be allowed, the WD bit is set in the PKRU register, so the access would be prevented. Now, we should note that PKU does not apply to instruction fetches. The processor ignores the bits for instructions. So what makes PKU attractive for intra-kernel isolation? There's several features. First, the domain switching actually is very cheap. So a single WRPKRU instruction takes roughly 26 cycles. And also it can support multiple domains at no additional cost, meaning that this one single WRPKRU can update the access rights for any subset of up to 16 domains. Finally, the pages from different domains can be located anywhere in memory, which means there's no need for changing the memory allocators, and there's no changes in the entropy of the existing randomization schemes. The only minor problem with this is, as the name implies, that it applies to user space. So let's bring PKU to the kernel. Now, in the rest of this talk, I will focus on our approach to intra-kernel isolation, and I will describe protection keys for kernel space, or PKK for short, and how we safely enable them. Then I will describe IskiOS, a system that uses PKK to enable execute-only memory for the code segment of Linux, as well as write-protected race-free shadow stacks. Then, before concluding, I will present our evaluation on micro-benchmarks and real-world applications. So, as I said earlier, protection keys for user space apply to user pages. That means pages that have the US flag set in their respective page table entry. So why don't we just mark all memory as user? Then that would solve the problem, right? Well, yes, but then a malicious or buggy program could now access and read and corrupt kernel data, which leads to the first observation, that PKU permissions make the US bit redundant for data. Since we enabled PKU for all memory, all we need to do is to place the kernel in different protection domain than user, and disable access to kernel pages when execution is in user mode. So in our design, we split the protection keys in half. We give the first half to kernel, keys 8 to 15 to user space, and by default, we place kernel in domain 0 and user in domain 8. But what about kernel code? How do we protect kernel code? Because if you recall, PKU does not apply to instruction fetches. Well, in this case, PKU cannot replace the US flag for code. And since we marked all memory as user, now user mode code can execute kernel instructions. But that was true also before, in the sense that a user program could even have a copy of the whole kernel image into its memory, mapped into its memory. So the problem is not that the kernel can execute any instruction, but it can execute a privileged instruction. It's the privileged instructions that are the powerful and potentially dangerous ones. Which leads to the second observation. Execution of privileged instructions depends only on the processor mode, not on the US flag. So, since PKK does not change the processor mode, the privileged instructions will trap if and when executed by user mode code. And that's it. That's how we resolve this issue. But what about attacks in which the kernel gets tricked into returning to user space with elevated privilege? Then Intel actually provides a hardening feature against such attacks, supervisor mode execution prevention, or SMEP, which actually prevents the kernel from executing instructions from user pages. However, for PKK to even function and kernel being able to execute its own instructions, we need to disable PKK. So to get around this without hardware support, we adopt a solution by KGuard, and we just add control flow checks on every indirect branch and return in kernel code that ensure that privileged execution never passes to the user portion of the virtual address space. Now, what about the kernel accessing inadvertently user data? Again, Intel provides a feature against these attacks. It's called supervisor mode access prevention. But since kernel is now in user memory, if we enable this, then kernel cannot access its own data. So we need to disable it for PKK to function again. Which leads to the third observation, which is that PKU permissions make SMAP redundant. Just like the US bit. So since we split the keys between kernel and user, all we need to do is to set the access disable bit in all of the user keys when we are in kernel mode. This will prevent the kernel from accessing real user data. So to recap the basic points until now, we set the US bit for all memory in order to enable PKU for kernel. We split the protection keys between user and kernel. We disable access to kernel keys when we are in kernel mode, in user mode, sorry. And we replace the Intel SMEP with control flow runtime checks, and we replace Intel SMAP with PKK itself. Now, the last bit to making PKK safe is to handle the WRPKRU instruction, because even though unprivileged, it might be dangerous for two reasons. The first is that applications themselves can modify the PKRU register at will to enforce their own security policies. So what we do here is that we need to allow that, but we also need to make sure that when they do that, they don't enable access to kernel domains. And to achieve this, we leverage techniques that we developed in a previous work, HODOR. Basically, whenever we map an executable, whenever we map a page as executable, we first inspect it to identify any opcode of the WRPKRU instruction. And if we find any, we place a debug watch point that will get triggered if and when executed. At that point, when it gets triggered, we will examine whether access to kernel domains is enabled. And if yes, we will just trap so that we prevent that. For more details, I will refer interested people to the paper, to the HODOR paper. But the second challenge is that now we have allowed kernel itself to modify PKRU at will for its own security policies. For one, kernel needs to save and restore the PKRU value on entry and exit from the kernel. Second, kernel has to change the permissions on protection domain switches for the security defenses that we are going to enable, and I will describe soon. So applications now may jump to these WRPKRUs in the kernel. So we need to make sure that these ones are also safe. And to make them safe, what we do is that we add a privilege check after every WRPKRU in the kernel. The check ensures that the current privilege level of the processor is ring 0, is basically the processor is executing in supervisor mode. And we do that by checking the code segment register. If it is, then great, we are in kernel mode right now and WRPKRU is okay. If not, then we infer that the WRPKRU was just executed by user mode code, and that means that probably user space just jumped to the kernel. So at that point, we trap. Now moving on to IskiOS, our system that, a Linux-based system that uses PKK for security defenses. The first one of them is execute-only memory, which, as I said, hides the code segment in memory that can be executed, but neither read nor written. So execute-only memory is not supported by x86, but IskiOS enables it using PKK. So what it does is that it dedicates the domain 1 to kernel code, core kernel and also modules, and it sets the access disable bit so that read access is disabled from these pages. And that's it. And note how we didn't have to rearrange the pages in memory in order for them to be protected. Now, IskiOS also provides shadow stack, which is security defense against attacks that corrupt return addresses on the stack. So a shadow stack typically will save a copy of these return addresses in a protected memory region, which typically in practice, what that means is that the shadow region is either located in a randomized position in memory, or it is completely inaccessible. And in IskiOS, we choose stronger security, so we design a write-protected shadow stack. So the way that we do that is that we first double the size of every stack in the kernel, and then we dedicate domain 2 to shadow stack space. Then by default, we disable the write access. So by default, shadow stack needs to be read-only. And when we need to save a return address on the shadow stack, so on every function call, IskiOS will enable temporarily the access with a WRPKRU instruction, and then disable it again as soon as it has stored the return address on the shadow stack. Now, traditionally, shadow stacks have been susceptible to raise hazards on x86. This is a byproduct of the x86 calling convention, which pushes the return address on the stack where it can possibly be corrupted, as well as the function prolog epilog instrumentation for shadow stacks, which typically copies the potentially corrupted return address to the shadow stack. So IskiOS, to prevent this, adopts a new calling convention, which is more RISC-like, and dedicates the R10 register to pass the return address to the callee safely. And instead of instrumenting prologs, it now instruments only call sites. IskiOS also explores some performance optimizations for the shadow stack, because write-protected shadow stacks exhibit high domain switching rates. In particular, they perform 2 switches per function call, which means 2 WRPKRU instructions in our case. That roughly amounts for 52 cycles per additional for every function call. So one obvious optimization opportunity is that if we just have fewer function calls, then we have fewer WRPKRU instructions overall. So let's just increase the inlining threshold until the point of diminishing returns. And obviously, higher inline threshold means some modest increase on the code size. A more interesting observation is that we don't always need to store the return address on the shadow stack because it might already be there. So as an example of how this can happen is that let's say that we have function foo called repeatedly in a loop. The first time that foo gets called, it pushes a call frame on the stack, and IskiOS pushes a shadow call frame on the shadow stack, having the return address for foo. Foo returns, then foo gets called back. Then IskiOS doesn't need to save this return address again. It's already there. It's already at the appropriate place. So we leverage this observation, and all we need to do is to add a comparison before storing. And if the return address is already there, we just avoid executing the 2WRPKRU instructions. So moving to evaluation, we implemented IskiOS as patches to the Linux 5.7 kernel and plugins to the Clang LLVM compiler. We used the Fedora 32 system equipped with 2 Intel Xeon Silver CPUs with 10 cores each. And we benchmarked on latency and bandwidth micro benchmarks from the LM-Bench suite. And also we used the real-world applications from the Phoronix test suite that are used to track performance regressions of the mainline Linux kernel. So in this picture, we see that PKK, except for very small services, incurs negligible overhead. For the geomin overhead is like roughly 11%, and the maximum is 25% for the write system call. And generally speaking, the cost for the small services is because it enters the kernel, so it incurs the cost of saving and restoring the PKRU register, but it performs a brief amount of work. So the cost is visible in these cases. Now, when the execute-only memory permissions are enabled, the cost is roughly the same as the PKK. So XOM doesn't add virtually any overhead over the PKK. Now, in this figure, we examine the performance impact of our shadow write optimization. And we see that from a roughly 520% overhead, maximum for the select 100 TCP micro benchmark, we drop to a 96% maximum. And from a geomin 3, 220%, we drop to a 36%. So we see that really this simple comparison and that avoids the redundant WRPKRUs has a dramatic effect in the performance. Now, when both optimizations are enabled, shadow write and inlining, the overheads drop even more to 43% maximum for the open-close micro benchmark and 20% roughly geomin across the latency micro benchmarks. And when both execute-only memory and the optimized shadow stack are enabled, the overheads remain roughly the same, 22% geomin overhead across the benchmarks. Now, we also examined real-world applications, 30 of them. 20 out of 30 incur less than 1% overhead. And on this table on the right, I'm showing only these 10 ones that incur more than 1%. From them, only 4 incur more than 10% overhead. And the maximum overhead is roughly 40% when both defenses are enabled. It incurs for the Apache and the Nginx servers. These two servers actually perform frequent system calls, and in every system call, they perform a very brief amount of work, which is where PKK suffers the most, as I explained earlier. So to conclude, we introduced protection keys for kernel space, or PKK, which is an alternative user kernel isolation that uses PKU in a novel and unconventional way. And we saw that PKK enables efficient and flexible intra-kernel isolation. And we demonstrated that by building execute-only memory and write-protected trace-free shadow stacks for the Linux kernel. Finally, we also showed that simple simple tweaks in the use of the WRPKRU instruction can significantly reduce the overhead, even for security policies that demonstrate high domain switching rates, such as the protected shadow stacks. So with that, I would like to thank you all and take any question.
Okay, so anyone here has any question? Okay.
Yep, so thank you for the talk. So if I understood correctly, you said you're basically putting everything now in user mode and then somehow rebuild the kernel mode again by doing some several checks again if you access those.
The user space.
Yeah, user space.
Not the user mode, like not the mode of the processor.
Sorry. But can we be sure that by doing so we don't introduce new, so that we really rebuild the kernel space one by one, or that we don't introduce new, so just by forgetting something? So
right.
For me, the things you said sound quite good, but can we be sure that this is the case?
So, exactly. So I presented all the steps that we could think of. Now, if there is something that you can think of, great, let me know. We would like to incorporate it. We think that we crossed all the, ticks. I think I said that wrong, but never mind, crossed all the ticks.
Oh, okay. So very impressive work. So I was wondering if you checked how many sort of recent vulnerabilities in the Linux or Android kernels would have been, the exploitation of those vulnerabilities would have been prevented by these defenses that you implemented?
By recent vulnerabilities, you mean Spectre and Meltdown, or something else?
No, I mean in terms of vulnerability, software vulnerabilities, right? Like CVEs.
Okay, like you're saying what security evaluation, let's say, of this.
Right.
So we didn't actually perform one, but execute-only memory and shadow stacks are known security defenses, and there are several other papers that explain how they solve them. Our goal was, how to make them more efficient and bring them to the kernel, and we showed how to do that. So
I was just wondering, because there are other ways to defend against those kinds of exploits. Mm-hmm. So, I was just wondering how important it is to do this nowadays.
So are you interested in the security guarantees of these policies, or
No, I think I understand the security guarantees. It's just how relevant they are nowadays.
Oh, I think they're still relevant, honestly. As I said, execute-only memory, it would be meaningless to have any diversification without having execute-only memory, right? Now, are they sufficient? I'm sure attackers can always find another way around any security policy that we come up with. But I think any strengthening measure is just going to offer something to our system. And by bringing them down in terms of overhead, I think it's a first step to deploying them. And I think that's what this work is about. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Really interesting work. I have one question. Have you thought about a timing such an attack when you do the optimization, where you leave the shadow stack and basically omit the additional instruction? Because I'm not sure if it's applicable, but for example, if you consider a square and multiply, where you have a loop which calls the square function, and then sometimes the multiply function, then probably you would have a timing side channel if only, the code would be faster if only square would be called, because then the shadow stack is still in the correct state.
I'm not sure I got the question. So can you repeat the first part?
Yeah, so the optimization you mentioned is that you, if you repeatedly call a function, then you leave the shadow stack as it is and omit the additional instruction that...
Right, so it's not, we don't do the optimization because of that. I just showed an example of how the optimization would be useful. So the optimization, it says, if the return address is there, just don't add it again. And I said how this might happen. Here's an example. A function gets repeatedly called, right? So optimization works independently of the case.
Yeah, okay. But considering that it's there and so you repeatedly call the function and then the optimization basically causes that the instruction is not executed and the code is faster, right? And if you then have a secret dependent function call in there, then it destroys the state of the stack of the return stack.
No, so the function call will happen anyway, right? We don't change that.
The function call depends on a secret then, right? And
there's no secret here. So we are calling a function and we are calling it again and again. And the shadow stack says, okay, let's save the return address in this protected memory region so that we know it will never get corrupted. That memory region is read only by default, right? So what the optimization says is that, well, if I stored it there the first time, no need to store it again, it's there. Nobody changed it. Because if somebody else gets called, maybe that's where you're getting at. If somebody else gets called later on inside my body as a function, it will get saved in the next stack frame. So it's a different location, right? So it doesn't overlap with the first stack frame. It's a stack, it just, cruises. And this optimization will apply again to the next call and so forth, so on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, impressive work. I have just a small question. I have seen that the computing overhead of the method you provided is quite different regarding the application, and you have mentioned, but very quite fastly, that is because the number of syscall. Can you elaborate on that? Because I believe that could be the key for the applicability of IskiOS in different.
Right. So for any application that will be calling not just frequently in the kernel, but also doing small work every time that it calls in the kernel, then the overhead will be visible because we add 2 WRPKRU instructions to the entry to kernel. So going frequently to the kernel and not doing anything, we just incur this overhead. But if we do actual work, then the 2 WRPKRU instructions add nothing compared to the rest of the work. So the applicability would be that. So any other application that doesn't do frequent calls with small amount of work should be fine.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to, let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.